Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I hope you're enjoying the study of Mark. We are today in lesson number 12, and this is the final. We're going to finish chapter 9. If you remember chapters 8 and 9 that we spent 3 weeks now, or this will be the third week, working through these chapters, they're a pivotal chapter because Jesus has spent all of his time in the Galilee and Capernaum area, around the Sea of Galilee, teaching, and now he is getting ready to do a speed run to Jerusalem. And he is running headlong into the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin and the rulers. And they're going to not like what he's saying. And so this section we're looking at here is pivotal because he's trying to get some things across to his apostles. Make sure they understand so they are prepared as they go to this journey down to Jerusalem. And remember in chapter 8 we have the Peter's great acknowledgement of who Jesus is, the great confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He is the Messiah. He is the Messiah. And then that follows with Jesus using the opportunity to explain clearly to him that he is going to have a confrontation with the leaders. They're going to put him to death, and he's going to rise on the third day. Nobody understood what he was talking about. Peter takes him aside and says, we're not going to let that happen. You're too important. The Messiah doesn't die. You don't understand that. But Jesus turns his back on him and says, get behind me, Satan. You don't know what you're talking about. This is the way it has to be. And then we get to chapter 9, and chapter 9 is wonderful because it opens up with this transfiguration event. So he takes Peter, James, and John on top of a mountain, and there he is transfigured before them with Elijah and Moses. And we talked about them representing the law and the prophets and all this spiritual world that the apostles just don't understand. And then as it all goes back to normal, I didn't even mention that God speaks out and says, this is my son. You listen to him. Remember, God's talking to Peter, James, and John at this point in time. He says, you listen to him. It's not the law and the prophets. It's Jesus. He's who you listen to. And then everything turns back to normal and they walk down the mountain. And on the way, Jesus says, now don't you tell anybody this until I'm raised from the dead. And they had no idea what that means. They said they worried about it. And then we have a confrontation. They can't heal. They can't take care of an evil spirit. And we talked about what all that means. Now we get to the second half. And it picks up in this same spot. They haven't gone anywhere. They're in that same area. But they're going to continue on with this discussion. So it says they left that place, the Capernaum area, the Caesarea Philippi area, and they went down through the Sea of Galilee. And this is the area where Jesus had done all of his teaching before. It says Jesus did not want anyone to know they were there because he was teaching his disciples. Remember, we just said he is really trying to make them understand this death, burial, and resurrection issue. He's mentioned it twice now, and they just don't understand it. They don't get it yet. Because he was teaching his disciples. And he said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered, handed over into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. This is the third time in 2 chapters that he has been extremely plain. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about stuff like this, I think, why don't they understand it? I mean, he said it as clear as he can say it. It says he's speaking plainly. He's not speaking in parables. But see, I think it's the parables that make us understand how the apostles might very well feel. See, it's not been that long ago, and he uses a phrase like, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. And he says, what does that mean? And they think he's hungry. He's in the boat and they only have 1 loaf of bread. And he says, it's not the bread. You don't understand. Remember in one of the parables when he's talking about the 4 soils, he says, this is an easy one. You don't understand this one? And he tries to lay it out for them. So he's been speaking in somewhat cryptic language and then taking them aside later and explaining it. But in this case, he's trying to speak plainly, and I think they're thinking he's talking in cryptic language. I think we would do the same thing. I think it would be hard for us to look and see what Jesus is actually saying when what he's saying is so different, so opposite of what we expect. And that is that He's going to be Messiah. He's going to be king. He's going to reign. There's no death that's part of that. There's no resurrection that's part of that. Yeah, resurrection, end of the age, they understood all that. But that's when everybody's resurrected, not one man, not just one man. They did not understand what he meant. And man, they were afraid to ask him. They were afraid to ask him. So, they come to Capernaum, which is on the Sea of Galilee. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" That's kind of interesting. So obviously there'd been an argument. He hadn't been close to them, but he knew what they were saying. He said, but they kept quiet. Why? Because they had been arguing about who was going to be the greatest, who was the greatest today. So sitting down, Jesus calls the 12 to him and he says, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. See, again, this makes no sense. They don't understand this. They have no concept of what he's trying to say. And this is why he's saying it over and over and over again. He wants them to understand this. He wants them to get it. But they just don't. So he says, anyone that wants to be first must be last. And you got to be servant of all. Now, we know that the Apostle Paul understood this. I want to look at what Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, a passage you very well know. This is a passage that most scholars believe was a song that they sang. You know, when it talks about songs and hymns and spiritual songs, this would have been one of those hymns or spiritual songs. It says, Christ Jesus, who was in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped, something to be held on to. Equality with God, one and the same with God, not going to hold on to that, but emptied himself of what? Of that position of deity, by taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. You see, Apostle Paul links all of this stuff together. When you talk about first and last, Jesus says, I am first. I'm the Messiah. I'm the Son of Man. I'm who the prophets were talking about. I am that one that's coming. But you got to understand, I came here to serve, not to be served. Therefore, if you're going to be in my kingdom, you're going to serve and not be served. Does that make sense? Didn't make sense to them. But Paul says he was obedient even to death on a cross, which is exactly what Jesus has been saying to these apostles. So then, to make the point, Jesus says, he took a little child whom he placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. Now, we get this confused sometimes because we like to think that Jesus loves the little children, all the little children of the world. And he does. But I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about here. He's using the little child as a performance art kind of thing, you know, where he's bringing the child and he sets him in front of him and he says, I want to make a point here. Now you've got to remember through this whole section, all 20 of these verses we're going to look at, he is talking about the same thing, but he's going to do it in a number of different ways. So what has he just been talking about? Greatness, servanthood. And he says, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. He's making a connection here. This child is anything but great. Children at that time had almost no rights. Do you remember Paul over in Galatians when he talks about the child is no different than the slave when they're a child? Even though when he comes of age, he will become the master. But as a child, he's just like the other child. They don't have any rights. They will have rights, but they don't have any rights. And that's the point he's trying to make here. That's the point he's trying to say. You take someone, the person you need to think about, the person you need to welcome is the person who is not of high esteem, but the one of low esteem. Remember, Jesus uses this example. He says, when you go into a party or something, don't take the best seat, go take the lowest seat. He says, if you take the best seat and then somebody comes along and says, well, you're not the highest one in rank, then they will ask you to get up and move to the lower seat and you'll be all embarrassed. But if you go down and you take the lower seat and you're supposed to be in a higher seat, then they'll come and they'll say, sir, please, you should be sitting up here. And they take you up to the better seat. And then you get the recognition for who you are. That's what Jesus is saying here. When you accept someone, you accept the lowly ones, not the greatest ones. And when you do that, and you accept them in my name, you're accepting me. And when you accept me, you're not accepting me, you're actually accepting the one who sent me, or the Father. So he's connecting again this dot between who's the greatest. It has nothing to do with greatest, boys. You're missing the point. It has everything to do with not being the greatest. And he uses the illustration of a little child. He's going to do that again. So John stops and he says, well, teacher, we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us. Now this, if this doesn't hit home to us and pretty much every other denominational group in the country, I don't know what does. It says, we saw someone driving out demons in your name. Now, why in the world would that bug the apostles? What was the problem in the previous chapter? They were trying to cast out a demon and they couldn't do it. Remember, they were arguing with the Pharisees about that, and they were arguing about not being able to cast out a demon. Why was that a big deal to them? Because they had just been sent by Jesus to be able to go heal the sick and cast out demons, and they had done that. But here they've got one that they can't. And now we've got somebody over here who's not even part of them, and he's casting out demons. They said, he is casting out demons in your name, but we told him to stop. You can't do that because you're not one of us. You're not walking around with us. You're not one of our tribe. You're not one of us. Let me make this a little personal. I've told you before about my dad being a fundraiser for the World's Fair Project in 1982 for the Churches of Christ. So he went around to congregations, came to this congregation, and I think you guys gave him some money. I don't remember if he remembered how much, but he did tell me that he was here. I mentioned that a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about my oldest daughter, Carrie, and when she was sick. But anyway, he was raising money for the World's Fair Project, and he went in to see someone who I'm not going to use the name because you'd all recognize the name, but it was someone who was very prominent in our brotherhood at the time. This is back in the late 70s, early 80s when they were raising the money. The World's Fair was in 1982 in Knoxville. And he goes in, and basically the guy said, I don't know if we want to be part of that or not. He said, where's this thing going to be? And Dad said, it's in the Christian pavilion, the religious pavilion where all the churches are and everything. Yeah, he says, oh, no, we don't want to be part of that. We're not a denomination. We are the church. Now, I don't know if that's an exact quote, but that's pretty much what he said. Do you hear what he's saying? They're not one of us. Those other people that claim to be Christians, yeah, they're not. They're not. They're not one of us. If they're one of us, then they're Christians, but if they're not one of us, they're not. Just because they claim to be Christian, just because they claim to serve Jesus, just because they put their money into serving Jesus, because they reach out to the lost, because they try to take care of the sick, because they worship Him, they don't do it right. They're not one of us. You've heard this before, right? I have. Glenn and I heard it. I didn't hear it. Actually, she did. When we first moved here and she was out shopping and somebody made a comment about our particular history. I don't think we're unique in that, but I think we are at times have been some of the most vocal in believing that we've got it figured out. No one else does. What does Jesus say? John says, he wasn't one of us. Jesus' reply, do not stop him. Jesus said, for no one who does a miracle in my name can in the next moment say anything bad about me, for whoever is not against us is for us. Do you hear what Jesus is saying? Same thing he said to the scribes and the Pharisees. He'll say, if you don't believe me for my words, believe me because of the miracles. These miracles are not things that can be done by just anybody. That's what Jesus is saying. If this guy's casting out demons in my name and it's working, then who are you to say it doesn't work that way? I like the end of that phrase though. It says, whoever is not against us is for us. You will see in Scripture that it's basically a do you believe, yes or no. You either for him or against him. There's no middle ground with Jesus. One of the silly things that I get tickled at or bothered with, depending on how you look at it, is people that use the phrase agnostic. Well, I'm agnostic. What does agnostic mean? It means that I haven't decided yet whether I believe or not. I'm sorry. If you haven't yet decided whether you believe or not, then you don't believe. There are no variations or ranges on what unbelief is. You either believe or you don't believe. That's why belief is such a big deal in Scripture. That's why Jesus is talking about belief. Now, there's all sorts of levels of our faith. But the concept of belief in Jesus, either you believe or you don't. Remember the guy we talked about with the son who they couldn't cast the demon out of? He says, I believe, help my unbelief. He says, I struggle with this stuff, but I absolutely believe. The implications of that I struggle with. How I live out that I struggle with, but I absolutely believe. That's what Jesus is saying. Look at how he defends it. Next thing, truly I tell you, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name because you belong to the Messiah will certainly not lose their reward. Now let's break that down a little bit. Look at what he's saying. Anyone who gives you, talking about the apostles, he's speaking to them. Anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name. So the person who's giving the water is doing it in Jesus' name, and he's giving you the cup of water because you claim to be of the Messiah. He's connecting the dots. He says, both of you are claiming to be mine. You claim you're of the Messiah. He's giving you a cup of water in the name of the Messiah. Even though you're not in the same tribe, he's not going to lose his reward. Do you get that? Do you see what he's saying? Do you see what he's saying? See, I think this is just one more illustration where he's trying to say, who's that little child? That little child is first not great. Second, that little child is not someone necessarily who is one of our group. Could be someone else. But yet it is someone who believes in Jesus. Do you hear that? This is not talking about sinners. This is talking about people who believe. I hate to tell you, but Jesus is far more inclusive than we are. Far more inclusive than most every church is. All right, let's keep on going. If anyone causes one of these little ones, he's back to his story about the children now. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them if a large millstone were hung around their neck and they were thrown into the sea. Now, he's not talking about little kids here again. Little kids is his metaphor. Little kids is the illustration he's using. He's got a kid sitting in front of me. He says, this kid believes in me. He says, anyone who causes one of these little ones who believe in me. He's not talking about whether a little child believes in him or not. And I'm not saying they can or can't. I'm saying that's not what this passage is talking about. This passage is talking about these other people. Starts off with great versus lesser versus greater. It then goes on to in the tribe, out of the tribe, and now he's talking about someone who is pushing back, who is creating a problem for another believer. And he says, it'd be better if you just didn't live. Now, he's not talking literally, but he's trying to make a point. And he's going to use this idea, and he's going to make the point three ways. He says, if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It's better for you to enter life maimed than with two hands to go into hell where the fire never goes out. Point two, if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter the life crippled than to have It is better for you to enter life crippled than to have 2 feet and be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell, where the worms that eat them do not die and the fire is not quenched. These are hard statements. Now, let's talk a little bit about whether we're supposed to cut off our hands, cut off our feet, and pluck out our eyes. Now, we've taken this many times and said, okay, this is saying you've got to get rid of all the sin in your life, and anything that you do that's sin, you've got to cut that off and get that out. That's true. That's a factual statement. Again, that's not what Jesus is talking about here. You see, we've got to look at it in the context of the discussion, and the discussion is, who's the greatest, in or out of my tribe, causing that little one to stumble? What's going on here? There's this battle. He's saying how you treat other Christians is vitally important. The Apostle John records Jesus saying it in a way that I'm sure you know. And he says, people will know you are my disciples by what? How you love me. How you do church. He says, no. People will know you're my disciples by the way you love each other. This is so important to Jesus. He is making this point. It is second to the point of the death, burial, and resurrection has to be understood. Why? Because the reason Jesus is coming to die is so that people can be His, and He wants to make sure that they understand who the His is. Who the His is? Do you get that? Why is that so important? Judaism had lost track of the fact that they were supposed to be God's priests to the rest of the world. That's what He said through Moses. You, Israel, are going to be my priests to the rest of the world. The same way the Levites were the priests to the Jews as a body were to be the Levites, in effect, to the world. And they had lost that. They had taken all those laws that were supposed to make them unique and bring them into an understanding of who God was, and they had made it into, we are something special. We are wondering who's greatest, and they knew who it was them. Do you hear that? See, that's the gist of all this. Who's greatest? That's what the disciples are arguing about. Well, who's going to be greatest in the kingdom? John said, I'm going to be greatest in the kingdom. Remember, James and John's mother comes to Jesus at one point and says, in your kingdom, can you put my 2 boys on either side of you? Left hand and right hand, number 1, number 2? Jesus said, not mine to give. You don't understand what you're asking for. See, in the time of Jesus, when people talked about a sin or talked about a problem or talked about something, they used the illustration of like a body, like the body part that was causing the problem as the problem. Now, if I took somebody and I took my hand and I slapped them, and I shouldn't be slapping anybody, they would say, the hand is what sinned. Well, we know it's not the hand. They knew it wasn't the hand. Jesus says it's not, how you act. It's what goes into you and then comes out of you, out of the heart. Remember, it's how we think, how we feel, what we do. That's what the big issue is, right? That's what they've done with the hand, the feet, and the eyes, trying to make a point. Have you noticed that 2 or 3 times they use the word hell and fire? Now, I want to make sure that, yes, hell does have fire, and yes, that is the way it is described. I don't know what hell really is. I don't know how to actually describe it, but I think that this metaphor is certainly a good one. But I don't think at this particular time that his purpose is to draw some kind of big metaphor for hell itself. I think he's trying to make sure they understand what they're talking about, because the word hell here is the word Gehenna. And you've probably seen this before. Let's look at some passages. Gehenna is the valley of Hinnom that was, I believe, was on the southwest side of Jerusalem. And it was a valley, and it is where they took their trash and they burned it all the time. But let's take a look at 3 passages from the Old Testament. Jeremiah chapter 7. and they have built the high places in the valley of the son of Hinnom to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire. This is child sacrifice. Prior to this becoming a trash heap, this was where they had their child sacrifices under the abominable practices of the Canaanites and the Israelites. In 2 Chronicles, it says, and Ahaz, I added Ahaz, and he made offerings in the valley of the son of Hinnom, and burned his sons as an offering according to the abomination of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. This is Ahaz. He's doing the same thing that the detestable people in Canaan were doing. Now, if you've been reading along with us on the story of the Bible this particular week, you're just about to finish the book of the book of Judges. And so in Joshua and Judges, you saw where the people did not push out all the people God told them to. They ended up living along beside the Canaanites. And so as God expected them to do, and as Moses told them in the book of Deuteronomy they were going to do, because they didn't follow God's law, they intermingled with the Canaanites. They adopted their gods. They adopted their practices. They intermarried. They diluted their belief in God to the point that even some of their kings offered their children as sacrifices. But Josiah changed that. Good King Josiah in 2 Kings 23. And Josiah defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no one might burn his son or his daughter as an offering to Molech. In other words, he said, we are not doing that. He tore down all the altars, he destroyed it, and he made it a garbage pile. And you burn garbage. So when Jesus talks about the fires that never go out, he's not just talking about a metaphor for hell. He's talking about a literal place where the fire burns 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 52 weeks a year. He says it is always there. Do you get that? It's always there. He said, you don't want this. This is not garbage. I'm talking to you about something that's important. And yes, you should even cut off your hands, cut off your feet, and poke out your eyes if you're not doing this. Because who you consider to be your brother is of vital importance in your ability to be one of my disciples and understand why I'm here and to be able to share that with the world. That's what I think he's trying to say. And then he ends with this. He says, everyone will be salted with fire. Now it's interesting that salt preserves and fire purifies. Unless wrong. He says salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty again? You can't. Once it's gone, it's gone. Have salt among yourselves and be at peace with each other. He ends the section the same way he started it. It's not about being great. It's about being at peace with each other. And he's talking about it's not people who are just exactly like you, who do the same thing you do each and every day. Why is that important? Because until we can understand that, we will always put the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ over here in a corner, and we'll believe it, and we'll acknowledge it, and we'll even preach it, but right there with it, we will stick all the things that make us feel great, make us feel like other people are not part of us, not one of us, and we will not truly understand what he's trying to do with the apostles and what he did for us. I hope that makes some sense. Next week he's going to move on to another place, and we're going to see him go into some more teaching, but he is heading to Jerusalem. And next week we end up in Judea. He's getting close. And so the confrontation with the scribes and Pharisees is about to heat up. So I hope you enjoy the reading. Please continue to read in the book of Mark. And I hope you have a blessed week. Talk to you next week.